All right, let's jump right in. Imagine you're on this expedition. You're in Antarctica, one of the most brutal places on Earth. It's 1912, and you're part of a team, and your goal is to be the first to reach the South Pole. You push yourself to the limit, and when you finally get there, you find out another team beat you to it.
Oh, I can't even imagine the disappointment.
Right. That crushing feeling, that's just the beginning of the story we're diving into today. The story of Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his expedition to the South Pole.
Ah, Scott of the Antarctic. A story that's captured imaginations for over a century.
And to guide our deep dive, we're using Scott of the Antarctic, a book by E. and J. Dowdeswell and Angela Seddon. You know, when you see a book about Antarctic exploration, you might think it's only for, like, serious polar enthusiasts. But trust me, this book is different.
It really is. The authors do a fantastic job of making it accessible and exciting for anyone, really.
And they also bring some really unique perspectives. Evelyn and Julian Dowdeswell are glaciologists, which means they're experts in glaciers and ice.
And you know what's really cool? Julian actually worked at the Scott Polar Research Institute.
Oh, wow. So they really know their stuff.
They do. And then you've got Angela Seddon, who specializes in photonics and glass.
So it's like a mix of science, history, adventure.
Exactly. A fascinating blend that adds so much depth to the story.
Okay, so picture this. It's the early 1900s, a time of intense national pride, right? And there's this fierce competition among nations.
Yeah, like who could achieve the most, discover the most.
And reaching the South Pole, that was seen as the ultimate prize, a symbol of a nation's power and scientific progress.
Absolutely. And for Britain, their champion in this race was Captain Robert Falcon Scott.
Now, Scott wasn't a complete newbie to Antarctica.
No, he had led an expedition a few years before, which really fueled his determination to conquer the South Pole this time.
But he didn't do it alone. I mean, we're talking about a massive undertaking, right? It took a whole team of skilled individuals.
Oh, absolutely. For the final push to the pole, Scott selected 4 men, each with unique skills that were vital to the mission.
All right, so who are these guys?
Well, first you have Edward Wilson, the chief scientist and a zoologist.
Right, Wilson. His presence reminds us this wasn't just about planting a flag. They had scientific goals, too, like collecting specimens, studying geology, you know.
Exactly. Their observations and data contributed significantly to our understanding of Antarctica.
It's amazing how much we've learned about this continent from these early expeditions.
It really is. Okay, then we have Lawrence Oates, an army captain. He was responsible for the dogs and ponies, crucial for transportation, considering the terrain.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Back then, they had to rely on animals for transport. Can you imagine crossing that unforgiving landscape without modern vehicles?
I can't. It really highlights the physical and mental challenges they faced. And, you know, the decision to use ponies was actually controversial at the time.
Why is that?
Well, ponies are known to be susceptible to the cold and, prone to injury. So there were concerns about their well-being from the start.
It makes you think about the ethical considerations of exploration, especially back then.
It does. Okay, next we have Henry Bowers, a Royal Indian Marine lieutenant, adding even more diversity to the team's backgrounds.
It's a good reminder that these expeditions weren't just about national competition. They brought together people from all walks of life, united by this thirst for exploration.
Absolutely. And finally, rounding out the final 5 was Edgar Evans, a petty officer in the Royal Navy. He was a tough guy with previous Antarctic experience.
That must have been invaluable. He understood the dangers, the teamwork, the mental fortitude needed to survive.
Absolutely. But it wasn't just the final 5, right? There was this whole support team working tirelessly behind the scenes. People like Herbert Ponting, the expedition's photographer.
Oh, yeah, Ponting. His photos gave us this incredible visual record of the journey.
They really did. And then there were Thomas Crean and William Lashley, petty officers who provided crucial support. Maintaining equipment, setting up depots, ensuring safety. Their dedication was just as important as those who reached the pole.
So imagine this incredibly diverse and skilled team setting sail on the Terra Nova in June 1910. They had this multifaceted mission to reach the South Pole, claim it for Britain, and conduct groundbreaking scientific research. The stakes were high.
Really high. Britain was determined to be at the forefront of polar exploration.
It was a matter of national pride. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Instead of relying on just one method of transport, they used a variety of approaches.
Yeah, they tried it all. They had motor sledges, which were, an attempt to embrace new technology.
Those early motor sledges, In that environment, I can't even imagine.
He was ambitious,
Yeah.
but ultimately they failed. The conditions were just too harsh.
It shows you just how unforgiving Antarctica can be.
It does. And then there were the ponies we talked about earlier. Sadly, due to the extreme conditions, they had to be sacrificed.
It's a harsh reality of exploration in those days.
It was. And after the motor sledges and ponies failed, they were left with dog teams, which they also ended up sending back.
He sent the dogs back. Why?
They made the decision to rely on man-hauling for the final push to the pole. Just imagine hauling all your supplies, battling the elements, every step, a monumental effort.
That's insane. It must have taken superhuman strength and endurance.
It did. It was a huge gamble, but it shows their incredible determination.
And after months of this back-breaking labor, after facing unimaginable hardships, they finally reached the South Pole on January 17th, 1912. Can you imagine the feeling?
I can only imagine. It must have been incredible.
But their elation was short-lived.
Yeah, they weren't the first. Amundsen's Norwegian flag was already there.
Oh man, what a devastating blow after all that effort, all those sacrifices, to find out you came in second.
It makes you wonder how that affected them psychologically.
Yeah,
Did it impact their morale on the return journey?
that's a great question. And speaking of the return journey, that's where things take a truly tragic turn. It's almost hard to wrap your head around, right? Reaching the South Pole, achieving this incredible goal, but then finding out you weren't the first.
It really makes you think about exploration, What drives people to push themselves to those limits? Is it all about being first? Or is there something more?
It's got to be more than just that, right? Like, for Scott and his team, they were also driven by a thirst for scientific discovery, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about national pride. They were collecting data, making observations, studying the geology. It was a multifaceted mission for sure.
And even though they weren't the first to the South Pole, they still made significant scientific contributions. Didn't they discover some important fossils?
They did. They found Glossopteris fossils.
Okay, Glossopteris fossils. I'm not a paleontologist. Can you break that down for us? What's the big deal about those?
So Glossopteris was this type of seed fern that lived millions of years ago. And finding their fossils in Antarctica, well, it basically proved that Antarctica was once connected to other continents, part of a huge supercontinent called Gondwana.
Wow, so they were piecing together the history of the planet even back then.
Exactly. It totally changed our understanding of Antarctica's past.
Mm.
But, as we know, the story takes a really tragic turn on their journey back.
Yeah, the return journey. It's a harsh reminder of just how unforgiving Antarctica can be. They were already weakened from their trip to the pole, supplies running low, the weather getting worse, and then on top of it all, knowing they weren't the first.
I wonder how much that psychological blow affected them. To have put in all that effort and come in second.
It had to take a toll, didn't it?
You'd think so.
Uh-huh.
And then tragedy strikes. Edgar Evans, remember him? He gets sick and passes away.
It really shows you the physical toll this expedition took, right? The extreme conditions, the lack of food, exhaustion. It must have pushed them to their absolute limit.
No doubt. And then, one of the most heartbreaking moments of the story, Lawrence Oates, knowing he was slowing everyone down, sacrifices himself. He walked right out into a blizzard to give his companions a fighting chance.
It's such a selfless act. To put the needs of the team above his own survival.
Incredible courage. And yet, even with that sacrifice, the tragedy doesn't end. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, they kept going but get trapped in their tent by a massive snowstorm.
I read that they were only 11 miles from a supply depot.
11 miles. So close to safety. It just shows the immense power of nature. How quickly things can change in Antarctica.
And sadly, they died there in their tent. Months later, a search party found their bodies, along with Scott's diary and letters.
It doesn't get much bleaker than that, does it?
It's tough to imagine what those last days must have been like. Alone, freezing, starving, knowing help was so close but out of reach.
But those diaries and letters, they offer such a powerful glimpse into those final days. Their struggles, their observations, their determination, even facing death. It's all there.
So here we have this epic story, right? Adventure, scientific discovery, hardship, and ultimately tragedy. But what does it all mean? Why are we still talking about Scott's expedition over 100 years later?
It's a good question. I think it speaks to something deep within us, this human desire to explore, to push boundaries, to understand the world, even if it means risking everything.
It's about that thirst for knowledge, that drive to test our limits, right? To face the unknown and leave our mark on the world. And even though Scott's expedition didn't achieve its initial goal, it definitely left a mark.
It did. They made those huge contributions to science, they inspired future generations, and their story still forces us to think about those big questions. The ethics of exploration, the true meaning of success and failure, and the limits of human endurance.
It makes you wonder, if Scott and his team had known what would happen, would they have still gone on this journey? Knowing the hardship, the sacrifice, the ultimate price, would it have been worth it?
That's something we each have to grapple with, isn't it? What are we willing to risk for our goals, our dreams, our desire to make a difference?
Deep stuff. And, as we move to the final part of our deep dive, there's something else that really stuck with me from Scott of the Antarctic. So, as we've been talking about Scott and his expedition, this one line from the book keeps popping into my head. He writes about the importance of recording their experiences, even the bad stuff, for the benefit of future generations. It really struck me.
It is incredible, isn't it? Even in those unimaginable conditions, facing those hardships, he was thinking about the bigger picture, the value of their journey for science, for all of us.
It makes you think, what would Scott think about his story still being told today, over a century later? Would he be surprised at all?
It's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
I imagine he'd be humbled by the lasting fascination with his expedition, but also, maybe a bit satisfied that their sacrifices, their contributions to science, their story of courage, it all still resonates with people.
Absolutely. And one thing that really impressed me about this book, Scott of the Antarctic, is how they present Scott's story. It's not just like a dry retelling of the facts.
Right.
It's this nuanced exploration of his motivations, his struggles, his successes and failures.
Yeah, they don't shy away from the complexities of his character. You see the tough decisions he had to make, the consequences that followed. It's a very human portrayal of Scott, flaws and all.
And, I think the authors' backgrounds play a big role in that. We were talking about Evelyn and Julian Dowdeswell, the glaciologist, and Angela Seddon, the photonics and glass expert, right? The way they weave their expertise into the story is so fascinating.
It really adds another layer of understanding, doesn't it? It's not just about what happened, but how we interpret those events, the questions we ask, the connections we make.
And speaking of connections, for anyone listening who's now totally hooked on Antarctic exploration, there are so many more amazing stories to discover. We've mentioned Ernest Shackleton. His leadership during his own expedition is legendary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shackleton's story is all about resilience, resourcefulness,
Yeah.
and that unwavering dedication to his crew. You want to learn more about him? Check out Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. It's a gripping read about their harrowing journey.
And for a first-hand account from someone who was actually on Scott's expedition, Apsley Cherry Garrard's The Worst Journey in the World is incredible. It's raw, honest, and gives you a real sense of the challenges they faced.
Oh, Cherry Garrard doesn't hold back. He talks about the brutal conditions, the moments of despair, but also the camaraderie, the humor they found, and that pure grit that kept them going. If you want to feel like you were right there with them on the expedition, that's the book to read.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Scott of the Antarctic, I'm left with this mix of awe and wonder, but also a profound respect for those who came before us, those who braved those conditions in the name of exploration and discovery.
It's a story that makes you think about your own limits. What drives you? What are you willing to sacrifice to reach your goals? It reminds us that success isn't always about being first, but about the journey itself, the lessons we learn, the impact we make.
And it leaves us with one final question to think about, doesn't it? Did Scott's team really fail in the end? Or does their story, even with its tragic ending, offer a different definition of success, one that goes beyond just being first?
It might be that true success lies in the pursuit of knowledge, the spirit of adventure, the commitment to something bigger than ourselves. Scott and his team embodied those values, and they continue to inspire us today.
That's a great point to end on. So there you have it, everyone, our deep dive into Scott of the Antarctic, a story of courage, tragedy, and the never-ending allure of exploration. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring.